They didn't come to apologize. They came with suitcases like my new home was theirs, and the moment I refused to let them in, my sister turned the whole family against me all over again. After 13 years of silence, why did they show up the very next morning, right after I bought a house? My name is Haley Reed. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've lived the kind of quiet people mistake for loneliness. But it was never loneliness. It was survival. Quiet is safer than chaos. Work is easier to understand than people. And for the past several years, work has been the one thing that never lied to me. I run a late-night dessert business out of an industrial kitchen on the east side of Denver. Cakes, bars, pastries, whatever keeps the lights on, and my hands busy. I work the hours other people avoid, because late-night kitchens don't ask questions. They don't care about your childhood, your family, or the version of you people like to gossip about. They only care whether you show up and whether you deliver. And for a long time, that was enough. Until last month. Last month, my business finally exploded in a way I never expected. It didn't happen like the movies, with some dramatic viral moment or a celebrity shout-out. It happened the way real success happens quietly. Then suddenly, a corporate order doubled. Then another contract landed. Then a regional cafe chain asked if I could handle weekly deliveries across multiple locations. The numbers on my spreadsheet started saying something I'd never said out loud. I could leave my tiny apartment behind. For years, I'd lived in a studio so small that my folding table doubled as a desk, a counter, and sometimes a place to sit and breathe when the day got too heavy. I didn't decorate. I didn't buy nice furniture. I didn't collect things. I lived like someone who might have to run again at any moment. But that month, I stood in front of my laptop and realized I wasn't running anymore. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I bought a house. Not a mansion, not a luxury showpiece, just a clean, sturdy place with a kitchen that felt like a promise, and rooms I hadn't decided how to use yet, a place that smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. A place where I could finally exhale without listening for footsteps in the hallway, or waiting for someone's mood to crash into the room like a storm. When I signed the papers, my hands shook. Not because I was afraid of the mortgage. I'd handled bigger risks than that. My hands shook because I realized I'd crossed an invisible line. I wasn't the girl people could erase anymore. I wasn't the sister they could blame and then forget. I wasn't the family scapegoat who disappeared into the background while everyone else played the starring roles. I had built something real, something stable, something mine, and for the first night in a long time, the house was completely still. No shouting, no slammed doors, no tension hanging in the air like humidity, just silence the kind that feels clean. I slept in my new bedroom with nothing but a mattress on the floor and a single lamp plugged into the wall. I didn't even unpack fully. I didn't want to rush the moment. I wanted to let it sink into my bones. This is my life now. Then morning came. I woke up early, the way I always do, even on days I don't have deliveries. It's a habit built from years of working before sunrise. I made coffee in a kitchen that still echoed because I hadn't filled it with anything yet. I stood barefoot on cold tile and stared out the window like I was watching a dream. And then my phone vibrated. A notification from my security camera. Movement detected. I glanced at the screen, expecting a package delivery or maybe a neighbor walking their dog. Instead, I saw two figures on my porch. A woman with a suitcase, and another woman standing just behind her, gripping her sweater the way she always used to when she wanted to look fragile. I didn't recognize them at first, not because I couldn't, but because my brain refused to accept it. Then my chest tightened. My sister, my mother, standing on my porch like they belonged there. I hadn't seen them in 13 years. 13 years without holidays, without birthdays, without a single text. 13 years of silence so complete it became its own environment, predictable, quiet, efficient. And now, the morning after I moved into my new house, they were there with luggage like they were checking into a hotel. They weren't cautious. They weren't nervous. They didn't hesitate. They looked confident. Like the gap between us had been a long weekend instead of more than a decade. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, frozen in the middle of my kitchen. My coffee sat untouched in my hand. The silence that had felt peaceful seconds ago suddenly felt like a trap. Because I knew that posture. I knew that energy. It was the same energy that shaped my childhood. The same certainty that Maya could do anything, and somehow the consequences would land on me. The same assumption that my mother's worry always wrapped itself around Maya like a blanket, and if Maya cried, the entire household reorganized itself around the sound. The past hadn't just returned. It had returned with entitlement. I didn't rush to the door. I didn't panic. I didn't open it out of shock. I watched them through the camera longer than I should have, long enough to take in every detail. Maya's hair was perfectly styled. Her nails were freshly done. She held the suitcase handle like she'd already decided she was coming inside. She stood closest to the threshold, positioned like a lead actress hitting her mark. My mother stayed half a step behind her, the way she always did when she expected me to comply without protest. That formation, Maya in front, my mother behind, was a pattern I hadn't seen in 13 years, but my body remembered it instantly. It was the formation of expectation, of obligation, of me being cornered before I even spoke. And then Maya leaned forward and knocked. Not a gentle knock, not a hesitant one, a firm knock, like she was knocking on a door she already owned. My heart started pounding not from fear, but from something worse. Recognition. Because I knew exactly what was about to happen. They were going to walk in like nothing happened. They were going to act like I was the one who had been gone. They were going to rewrite the past in real time. And if I didn't cooperate, they were going to punish me the same way they always had, by turning everyone against me. And the thing is, it would have worked once. It would have worked on the old me. The version of me who apologized for things she didn't do. The version of me who tried to explain, tried to fix, tried to make everyone comfortable. The version of me who believed love meant endurance. But that girl didn't live here anymore. I walked to the entryway slowly. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, because I was trying to stay in control of my breathing. On the small console table near the door, I had placed a folder the day before. I hadn't told anyone about it. No one knew it existed. But something in me, some instinct built from years of being blamed, erased, and misunderstood, had whispered that if the past ever returned, it wouldn't return gently. So, I prepared. Inside the folder were things I never would have thought to prepare when I was younger. Not emotional letters. Not accusations. Just boundaries. Written ones. A formal notice about uninvited visits. A record of harassment policies. A list of steps I would take if anyone refused to respect my property. It wasn't revenge. It was adulthood. It was the kind of protection I'd never been allowed to have as a child. I picked up the folder and held it in my hand like a weight. Then I opened the door only a few inches, just enough to see their faces. Just enough to remind them I was real, but not enough to give them access. Maya smiled, first wide, bright, rehearsed. The kind of smile that says, "Look at me, I'm trying. So if you don't respond the way I want, you'll look like the villain." My mother's expression was tighter. Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the hallway behind me like she was evaluating the space. Neither of them said, "We're sorry." Neither of them said, "Can we talk?" Instead, Maya shifted her suitcase forward, as if stepping inside was a formality, as if my home was an extension of their entitlement. And standing there, with my hand on the door and the folder pressed against my palm, I realized something that hit harder than any argument ever could. They didn't come back because they missed me. They came back because I had something now. A house, a business, stability. And to them, stability was not something I deserved. It was something they deserved access to. And if I didn't give it willingly, they would do what they always did. They would make me pay for it socially. They would turn the family against me again. But this time, I wasn't 19. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't begging to be understood. I was standing in the doorway of a house I bought with my own hands, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to explain. I felt the urge to protect. So before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you what I did, what I said, and how quickly the family I hadn't seen in 13 years turned into a storm on social media, let me take you back. Because the truth is, my sister didn't turn my whole family against me in one day. She trained them to, and it started so early. I didn't even realize I was being set up until it became the only role I was allowed to play. And once you understand that, you'll understand why. When they showed up on my porch with luggage, I didn't feel like I was facing a reunion. I felt like I was facing a test I had failed my entire childhood. But this time, I had already decided I wasn't going to fail it again. The truth is, my sister didn't turn my whole family against me in one dramatic moment. She didn't need to. She did it the way certain people learn to do it early, quietly, patiently, through repetition. She learned which expressions made adults soften, which tears made people panic, which tremble in her voice made everyone rush to fix whatever she claimed was broken. And by the time we were old enough to understand what was happening, the roles had already been assigned. I was the oldest. That meant I was useful. Maya was the youngest. That meant she was protected. And my mother, Evelyn, wasn't cruel in the loud, obvious way people imagine when they hear the word favoritism. She didn't scream. She didn't hit. She didn't announce that she loved one daughter more than the other. She did something subtler and, in some ways, more damaging. She worried. Constantly. She worried about Maya, the way some people worry about glass, like she might shatter at any moment. And when someone treats a child like they're fragile, the entire household begins to revolve around that fragility. I learned responsibility the way other kids learned instruments, not through lessons, but through repetition. I was barely old enough to drive when I started picking up shifts at a diner near our neighborhood. I told myself it was for extra money, but the truth was, work was the only place where effort had a clear outcome. You showed up, you did the job, you got paid. There were rules, there were schedules. There was no guessing game about whether you were loved. At home, love always came with conditions. If Maya was tired, we all lowered our voices. If she was stressed, plans changed. If she cried, everything stopped. It wasn't that my mother didn't care about me, it was that she assumed I could handle anything. And once people assume you can handle anything, they stop asking if you should. I became the one who filled the gaps. I handled rides, chores, errands, phone calls. I reminded my mother about appointments. I made sure the fridge had food. I learned to read the air in a room the way sailors read weather. I could tell when my mother's patience was thin and when Maya's mood was about to tip into something dramatic. I didn't do it because I wanted praise. I did it because keeping things calm felt like survival. And Maya watched. She watched how adults responded when she looked small. She watched how quickly my mother's eyes softened when she sighed and said she was overwhelmed. She watched how relatives leaned in when she spoke about her feelings like they were facts. She didn't need to be malicious for the pattern to form. She just needed to notice what worked. I didn't resent her in the beginning. That's the part people don't understand. I didn't grow up thinking, my sister is the enemy. I grew up thinking, this is just how families work. Someone is strong, someone is sensitive, and the strong one doesn't get to be tired. The shift happened slowly, like a table leaning after years of pressure on one side. Small things started to tilt in a direction I couldn't correct. A missing wallet meant questions directed at me first. A forgotten appointment became an assumption that I hadn't passed along the information correctly. A broken dish wasn't an accident, it was carelessness. And carelessness was something my mother seemed to associate with me, even though I was the one holding the whole house together. Whenever I tried to clarify, my mother's expression tightened. Not angry, worse, disappointed, like I was complicating things by speaking at all. The look said, "Why can't you just make this easier? Why can't you just stop?" And the older I got, the more I realized that in our house, easier didn't mean truth. It meant whatever keeps Maya calm. The moment that made everything crystal clear came during one summer afternoon when Maya misplaced a small amount of cash she'd saved for a school trip. It wasn't much, barely enough for snacks and a souvenir. But you would have thought she'd lost something priceless based on the way she reacted. She stood in the kitchen with tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, breathing unevenly, turning her palms upward as if asking the universe why it was against her. My mother moved toward her immediately, like a magnet drawn to distress. Maya's voice wobbled as she said she didn't know where the money went. She said it softly, like she didn't want to accuse anyone. but her eyes flicked toward me in a way that planted the seed without speaking it. I remember standing there, holding a dish towel, feeling a strange heaviness in my chest. I tried to explain that I hadn't touched her money. I said it calmly. I said it like someone who assumed the truth mattered. But the room shifted anyway. My mother didn't yell at me. She didn't call me a thief. She didn't say anything dramatic. She just looked at me with that disappointed certainty, the kind that feels like a verdict. And in that single look, I understood something I'd never been able to name before. Explanations didn't matter in a place where feelings weighed more than fact. Maya didn't have to prove anything, she only had to look hurt. And because she looked hurt, my mother's mind automatically searched for someone to blame. I was the easiest option not because I was guilty, but because I was strong enough to absorb it. That day changed the atmosphere of our house more than any argument ever could. It wasn't about the money, it was about what the moment revealed. Maya had learned that vulnerability was currency, and my mother had learned without realizing it that she could punish me without raising her voice, simply by choosing to believe Maya's emotions over my words. After that, the pattern hardened. If Maya had a late project, it was because I didn't remind her. If she missed the bus, it was because I took too long in the morning. If she seemed anxious, it was because I wasn't supportive enough. Sometimes these accusations were spoken. Most of the time they weren't. But unspoken judgments have a way of sinking into your skin. You start living like you're guilty even when you've done nothing wrong. I tried, for a while, to fight it. I tried to be clearer. I tried to be more organized. I wrote reminders on the fridge. I left notes. I double-checked schedules. I thought if I became perfect, the blame would stop landing on me. It didn't, because the blame wasn't about my behavior. It was about my role. In our family, Maya was the one who needed protection. I was the one who was supposed to provide it. And if Maya failed at something, it couldn't be her fault because that would mean she wasn't fragile. That would mean she wasn't the center of my mother's worry. So the responsibility had to go somewhere else. It went to me. The hardest part was realizing how quickly other relatives absorbed that version of reality. When my mother told stories at family gatherings, Maya was always the sensitive one, the misunderstood one, the one trying her best. And I was the one who didn't understand her, the one who was too harsh, the one who was distant. People nodded along because my mother sounded convincing, and Maya would sit there quietly, eyes downcast, letting the narrative form around her like a warm blanket. I started retreating into work because work didn't ask me to be a villain to make someone else feel like a hero. Work didn't punish me for telling the truth. Work rewarded effort. Work was simple. Home was not. Home was a place where my words were treated like complications, and my silence was treated like proof. And once you realize you can't win in a system, you stop trying to win. You start trying to survive. So I became quieter. I stopped sharing things about my day. I stopped asking for help. I stopped expecting fairness. I learned to let the household run smoother by disappearing inside it. And I think that's what my mother preferred. Because when I was quiet, Maya stayed calm. When Maya stayed calm, my mother felt like a good parent. And when my mother felt like a good parent, no one had to look too closely at what was happening to me. People always talk about family betrayal like it happens in one sharp moment, like there's a single sentence or a single argument that breaks everything apart. But sometimes it's slower than that. Sometimes it's the accumulation of small, unchallenged assumptions. The way a family decides, without ever saying it out loud, that one child is the heart and the other is the shield. I was the shield. And shields don't get comfort, they get dense. By the time I reached my late teens, I was exhausted in a way I didn't know how to explain. Not tired from school or work, but tired from constantly carrying a weight no one acknowledged. I watched my sister move through life like consequences were optional, like every mistake could be softened by tears and a trembling voice. And I watched my mother protect her with a devotion that left no room for anyone else. Still, I didn't hate them. I just started to feel invisible. And invisibility does something dangerous. It convinces you that your needs don't count, that your hurt doesn't matter, that if you speak up, you're selfish. So I stayed quiet. I kept working. I kept making things easier for everyone else. Until the day the balance finally tipped in a way I couldn't correct. Until the morning, Maya returned my car with a dented bumper, and I realized the story had already been written before I even walked into the room. That was the moment the pattern stopped being a background hum and became a verdict. And once a family decides you're the problem, they don't just blame you. They build a world where you don't belong in it at all. The dent in my car wasn't what broke my family. It just revealed how fragile my place in it had always been. I remember the sound first, the scrape of metal against something hard, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop before you even see the damage. I wasn't outside when it happened. I was in my room, pulling on my uniform for my diner shift, mentally rehearsing the day the way I always did. I had lent Maya my old sedan that morning because she said she needed to run a quick errand before school. It wasn't the first time. She'd used it plenty of times before, and I'd never made a big deal about it. At that point, saying no in our house wasn't really an option. Saying no made you the problem, so I said yes. When I heard the scrape, I paused. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing. A trash bin tipping, a bike falling, something harmless. But then the front door slammed, and I heard Maya's footsteps fast, uneven, like she was running from something. By the time I walked into the kitchen, the scene was already set. Maya was standing in front of my mother, trembling, clutching her coat tight around her like she'd been attacked. Her eyes were glossy. Her breathing was shallow. She wasn't crying loudly, but she was performing the kind of controlled distress that always worked. The kind that made my mother's face change instantly, her worry snapping into place like armor. My mother didn't even look at me at first. She was focused on Maya, on the fragile center of the room. Maya spoke in fragments, the way people do when they want to sound traumatized. I didn't mean to. I didn't see it. My mother's hand went to her shoulder, soothing her. And then, finally, my mother turned to me. Her expression wasn't confusion. It wasn't curiosity. It was certainty. That's what hit me hardest. She hadn't asked what happened. She hadn't asked where the car was. She hadn't asked whether anyone was hurt. She had already decided what kind of story this was going to be. And in that story, I was responsible. Not because I'd done anything, but because I was always responsible. Maya's voice wavered as she said something about how she shouldn't have been driving it. She said it like a confession, like she was taking accountability, but the way she framed it made it sound like the real issue wasn't the damage, it was that she had been forced into the situation. And then she looked at me. Just a glance, just long enough. My mother followed her gaze. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about Maya denting my car. It was about me letting her use it, me putting pressure on her, me not thinking. I stood there, stunned, watching the blame shift like a living thing. I tried to speak. I tried to say, calmly, that Maya had asked to borrow the car, that I hadn't forced her, that accidents happen, that the only thing that mattered was whether she was okay. But my words didn't land. They never did in that house. My mother's tone sharpened, not into anger, but into disappointment, the kind that feels like you're being judged as a person, not corrected for a mistake. "You always do this," she said. I remember staring at her, confused, because I didn't even know what this meant. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused Maya. I hadn't even mentioned the damage yet. But in my mother's mind, this was me speaking at all. This was me refusing to accept blame quietly. This was me disrupting the emotional comfort Maya had built around herself. Maya's breathing got shakier. She pressed her lips together, like she was holding back tears. My mother's eyes softened again immediately, and I watched it happen in real time, the same pattern I'd seen since childhood. Maya's distress pulled my mother toward her, and my presence pushed my mother away. I felt like I was standing in a room where gravity worked differently depending on who you were. Then my mother said something that changed everything. She didn't say, "Maya, you need to be more careful." She didn't say, "Haley, I'm sorry that happened." She said, "Do you know how scared your sister is right now?" And I realized, with a cold clarity, that my car didn't matter. My feelings didn't matter. My sister's fear mattered more than my reality. That was the moment the pattern stopped being something I could tolerate and became something I couldn't ignore. Because if my mother could look at a situation where Maya had damaged my property and still find a way to make Maya the victim and me the problem, then the truth had no home in our family. And once you understand that, you start to see everything differently. After that morning, the atmosphere in the house changed in subtle but decisive ways. It wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches, no doors slammed in my face. It was worse than that. I became unnecessary. Plans started forming without my input. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. My mother stopped asking about my schedule. When relatives called, I wasn't included in the updates. When Maya had something going on, the household revolved around it the way it always did, but now there was an added layer, an unspoken agreement that I was the difficult one. The one who didn't support Maya. The one who made things tense. The one who didn't understand how fragile she was. And the strangest part was that no one ever said it directly. They didn't have to. You can feel when you're being rewritten. I tried to hold on at first. I did what I always did. I tried to fix it. I cooked dinner more often. I cleaned more. I stayed later after my shifts so I could be present. I offered rides. I asked my mother if she needed help. I tried to show her, through actions, that I wasn't the enemy. But the more I tried, the more I realized something heartbreaking. I wasn't being punished for what I did. I was being punished for not being who they needed me to be. They needed me to be the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who absorbed blame so Maya could stay innocent, and my mother could stay comfortable. And I couldn't do it anymore. Not after that morning. Not after seeing, so clearly, how quickly they could decide I was wrong without even asking what happened. A few weeks later, I came home from work and found my mother and Maya sitting at the kitchen table. They stopped talking when I walked in. The silence was thick. My mother's hands were folded like she was preparing to deliver a verdict. She said, "We need to talk." I remember my heart sinking, because in my family, "we need to talk" never meant a conversation. It meant a decision had already been made. My mother told me I was pulling away, that I was cold, that I was making the house uncomfortable. Maya sat beside her, eyes lowered, quiet, the picture of wounded innocence. My mother said she didn't recognize me anymore. And I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. She didn't recognize me because she'd never truly seen me. She had seen a role, a function, a shield. And now that the shield was cracking, she was calling it betrayal. I tried to speak. I tried to explain how exhausted I was, how lonely I felt inside my own home, how every time Maya cried, the truth disappeared, how every time I defended myself, I became the villain. But my mother's face tightened again. "Why do you always make it about you?" she asked. That sentence landed like a slap. Because for my entire life, I had made it about everyone else. I had made it about Maya's moods, Maya's needs, Maya's comfort. I had made it about my mother's stress, my mother's worry, my mother's version of what a good daughter looked like. I had made myself small so the house could feel stable. And the moment I tried to speak about my own pain, I was accused of selfishness. That night, I went to my room and sat on my bed for a long time, staring at the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just felt empty, like something inside me had finally stopped trying. The next morning, I packed a bag. Not dramatically, not with an announcement. I packed the way someone packs when they've already mourned something for years. I told myself it would be temporary, that I just needed space, that time apart would reset things, that my mother would realize what she was doing, that Maya would grow up. I rented a tiny studio across town, the kind of place with thin walls and a window that faced a brick building. I slept on a mattress on the floor and ate dinner standing at the counter because I didn't own a table yet. And for the first few days, I waited. I waited for my mother to call. I waited for Maya to text. I waited for someone to ask if I was okay. No one did. At first, I told myself they were giving me space. Then weeks passed. Then months. And the silence started to feel intentional. It wasn't that they forgot me. It was that the version of the story they'd built didn't include me as a person anymore. It included me as a lesson, as a warning, as the sister who abandoned the family. I heard through someone else that Maya had told relatives I left because I couldn't handle responsibility, that I wanted freedom, that I was selfish. And the worst part was realizing how easily people believed it, because Maya had already trained them to. She had spent years building the image of herself as fragile and misunderstood, and me as cold and difficult. So when I left, it didn't look like survival. It looked like proof. And that's how it happened. That's how the family didn't just drift away from me. They cut me off. Not with a fight, not with a final conversation, but with a quiet, collective decision to stop reaching out, stop including me, stop acknowledging me at all. And once that door closed, it stayed closed for 13 years. Until the morning, I bought a house. Until the morning, my sister and my mother stood on my porch with suitcases like they had never left. And I realized, in that moment, that the silence wasn't over. It was just changing shape. When people hear 13 years, they imagine something dramatic. A final argument, a slammed door, a screaming match that ends with someone shouting, "Don't ever come back." But that isn't how my family cut me off. They did it the way they did everything else, quietly, politely, and in a way that made it look like it was my choice. At first, I told myself the silence was temporary. I had moved into that tiny studio across town with a mattress on the floor and 2 plates I bought from a discount store. I didn't even hang curtains right away. I kept thinking, this is just space. This is a reset. This is what adults do when things get tense. I believed that once my mother had time to breathe, she would call. That once Maya calmed down, she would realize she'd pushed things too far. That anyone would reach out and say, "Hey, are you okay?" I waited. I checked my phone too often. I stared at the screen like it might change out of pity. I told myself not to be dramatic, not to be needy, not to be the difficult one they already believed I was. I kept my pride intact the way you keep a fragile dish intact, by not touching it too much. Days passed, then weeks. And the longer the silence stretched, the more I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. They weren't giving me space. They were replacing me. I found out in pieces, the way you find out you've been written out of a story through other people, through hints, through conversations that stop when you walk into the room. A coworker mentioned she'd seen photos of Maya at a family barbecue. I wasn't in the photos. A neighbor from my old street asked if I'd made up with everyone yet, like it was a fight I'd started. An aunt I barely knew sent me a message that said, "Your mother is heartbroken. You only get one family." It was the first time anyone had contacted me, and it wasn't to ask how I was doing. It was to remind me that I was the problem. That was when I realized Maya wasn't just enjoying the attention. She was building a narrative. She had always been good at that. Even as a kid, she could turn a simple situation into a story where she was the wounded center, and everyone else was either her rescuer or her betrayer. Now she had an audience bigger than our living room. She had relatives, family, friends, even strangers online who loved a clean, emotional storyline. And she gave it to them. I didn't see her posts at first. I wasn't connected to the family accounts. I wasn't in group chats. But word travels, especially when the story is dramatic. Someone forwarded a screenshot to me one day with no comment, like they were dropping a grenade and walking away. Maya had posted a photo of herself sitting on her bed, knees pulled to her chest, looking small. The caption said something like, "Some people leave when things get hard, but healing means learning you can survive without them." She didn't write my name. She didn't need to. The comments were full of sympathy. Relatives wrote things like, "We're here for you, and you're so strong," and family always reveals itself. And as I scrolled, my hands started shaking. Not because I was angry, because it was surreal. I was watching my sister mourn me publicly while I was still alive. I was watching my family comfort her for losing me, while no one checked whether I had eaten dinner that night. That was when the loneliness turned into something sharper. It wasn't just that I was alone. It was that I had been replaced by a version of myself that didn't exist. I tried to correct it once. Just once. I sent my mother a message. It was simple, calm. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a rant. It was me reaching out like an adult. I said I didn't want to fight. I said I missed them. I said I wanted to talk. She never replied. A week later, my phone number stopped working for her. I didn't realize it at first. I called and it went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. I thought maybe her phone was off. Then I called from a coworker's phone. It rang. She answered. And when she realized it was me, she hung up. That moment hurt in a way I still struggle to describe. It wasn't explosive pain. It was quiet, clean, and final. Like a door closing so softly you don't hear it. But when you turn around, it's locked. After that, I stopped reaching. Not because I didn't care. Because I finally understood that caring didn't matter if I was the only one doing it. The years that followed weren't a montage. They weren't inspirational in the pretty way people like to package survival. They were long. They were exhausting. They were ordinary. I worked whatever jobs kept me moving. I brewed coffee at dawn, my hands smelling like espresso and bleach. I cleaned office buildings at night, pushing a cart down hallways that were too quiet. I took weekend shifts at diners where the regulars snapped their fingers when they wanted more water. I learned how to keep my face neutral, no matter what someone said to me. Because in service work, your emotions aren't allowed to take up space. In a strange way, it prepared me. Because I had already been trained at home to make myself small. The difference was that at work, the rules were honest. People could be rude, but the transaction was clear. You worked, you got paid. You didn't have to earn love from someone who only offered it when you were useful. I lived in cheap apartments with thin walls. I learned to sleep through neighbors arguing. I learned to eat quickly. I learned to budget like my life depended on it because it did. And through all of it, I kept thinking there would be a moment where my family realized what they'd done. A holiday where they missed me. A birthday where my mother felt guilty. A quiet night where Maya realized she'd pushed too far. But that moment never came. Instead, the silence became tradition. I heard about my family through other people the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in. Distant, impersonal, like it had nothing to do with you anymore. I heard that Maya graduated and posted a long caption about overcoming betrayal. I heard that my mother attended a church group and told people she was praying for her lost daughter. I heard that my cousins got married. One of them had a wedding where I wasn't invited, but someone told me later I was mentioned in a speech as an example of what happens when you choose yourself over family. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed after hearing that and feeling something inside me go numb. Because the truth was, I hadn't chosen myself over family. I had chosen survival over being slowly erased. But they didn't want that version of the story. The version they wanted was cleaner. It had a victim. It had a villain. And it made everyone else feel morally safe. I became the villain. I became the sister who pulled away. The one who didn't care. The one who abandoned them. And once that label settled, it gave everyone permission to stop trying. My mother changed her number at some point. I found out by accident. I tried calling on a holiday, and a stranger answered. I apologized, confused, and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone like it had betrayed me. I didn't cry right away. I just sat. Because crying felt like admitting something I couldn't afford to admit. That my mother had moved on without me. That I was no longer a daughter in her life. That I had been replaced by a story. There's a kind of grief that comes with being alive while people act like you're gone. It's not the grief of death. It's the grief of being misunderstood so completely that you stop trying to be understood at all. Over time, I stopped expecting messages. I stopped checking the calendar with that small, hopeful ache in my chest. I stopped imagining reunions. I built routines instead. I worked. I slept. I paid bills. I kept moving. And slowly, without announcing itself, something shifted. The silence that had once felt like punishment started to feel like peace. Not because I forgave them. Not because it didn't hurt. But because I stopped living in the waiting room of their approval. I stopped rehearsing arguments in my head. Stopped building imaginary conversations where I finally said the perfect sentence that made my mother understand. Stopped fantasizing about a moment where Maya admitted she'd manipulated everyone. I stopped because it was exhausting, and because my life, quiet as it was still mine. That was when baking entered my world in a way that wasn't just survival. At first, it was small. Something I did late at night after shifts, when the world was asleep, and no one could demand anything from me. I would mix batter in a chipped bowl, listening to the hum of my old refrigerator, measuring sugar like it was something sacred. The kitchen was the only place I felt fully in control. If you follow a recipe, the result makes sense. If you put in the work, you get something real. It was the opposite of my family. I started bringing cookies to coworkers. Then someone asked if I could make brownies for a small office party. Then someone else asked if I could do cupcakes for a baby shower. It wasn't a business yet. It was just something that felt like mine. And for the first time in years, I felt something other than numbness. I felt possibility. I didn't realize it then, but that was the beginning of the life that would eventually bring my family back to my doorstep. Not because they missed me, because they noticed I had built something they could benefit from. And that's the part people don't like to admit about toxic families. They don't come back when you're healing. They come back when you're stable. They come back when you're successful. They come back when you finally have something worth taking. And when I look back now, I understand something with painful clarity. Those 13 years weren't just time. They were training. They trained me to live without them. They trained me to stop begging. They trained me to stop explaining. They trained me to build a life so solid that when they finally returned, they couldn't knock it down with guilt. Because by the time my sister and my mother stood on my porch with suitcases, I wasn't the girl they left behind anymore. I was the woman who had learned how to lock a door without shaking. And the next part of my story, how I went from surviving to building a business that changed everything, starts in a place no one in my family ever cared to look. A shared industrial kitchen. At midnight, when the city was quiet. And for once, so was my mind. The first time I rented that shared kitchen, I didn't walk in like a business owner. I walked in like someone borrowing oxygen. It was on the east side of Denver, tucked between a repair shop and a warehouse that always smelled faintly of oil and wet cardboard. The building wasn't pretty. The walls were scuffed, the floors were industrial tile, and the air carried that permanent mix of metal, detergent, and heat that only commercial kitchens have. But the moment I stepped inside, something in my chest loosened. Because no one knew me there. No one cared about my family. No one cared about who I used to be. No one had a story about me already prepared. All they cared about was whether I cleaned my station, whether I paid my rental fee on time, and whether I left the kitchen the way I found it. That kind of neutrality felt like kindness. I took the late-night slot, partly because it was cheaper, and partly because no one else wanted it. Midnight to 4 a.m. wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of schedule you post about online with cute captions. It was the kind of schedule you choose when you're still living in survival mode. When you're trying to build something quietly, without anyone watching, without anyone interfering, those hours became my sanctuary. At first, I didn't even have a plan. I brought a notebook full of recipes I'd scribbled down over the years, things I'd made in tiny apartments with unreliable ovens, adjusting measurements by instinct because I couldn't afford to waste ingredients. I brought a cheap hand mixer, a set of measuring cups, and a few battered baking pans that had followed me through 3 different apartments. The first batch I made in that kitchen was a simple chocolate bar, nothing fancy. But when I pulled it out of the oven and the smell filled the room, warm cocoa, butter, vanilla, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt grounded. For years, my life had been about reacting to bills, to exhaustion, to loneliness, to the quiet ache of being cut off. But in that kitchen, I was creating something from scratch. I was choosing every ingredient, every step, every outcome. If something failed, it was because I needed to adjust the recipe, not because I was inherently flawed. That difference mattered more than I knew. The orders started the way most small things start, almost by accident. I brought cookies to a coworker's birthday. Someone asked if I could make a tray for their office meeting. Another person asked if I could do cupcakes for a baby shower. At first, I charged barely enough to cover ingredients because I didn't know how to price my work. I was still in the mindset of someone who didn't believe she deserved profit. But people kept asking, And not in the polite, oh, this is cute way, in the way that told me the product was actually good. I started tracking everything in a notebook: flour, sugar, butter, eggs, how much each batch cost, how long it took, which recipes held up best in transport. I didn't have a mentor. I didn't have family support. I didn't have anyone cheering for me. I had spreadsheets and stubbornness. Steady progress became my new language. The first time I got a real bulk order, it came from a local office manager who had tasted one of my dessert bars at a small event. She called me and asked if I could provide dessert for a corporate gathering enough for about 80 people. I remember holding my phone in my kitchen, staring at the wall as she spoke, because my brain couldn't process the number. 80. That wasn't a favor. That was a job. I told her yes before I could talk myself out of it. Then I spent the rest of the day panicking quietly. That week was brutal. I worked my regular shifts, then went straight to the shared kitchen at night. I whisked batter until my wrists ached. I measured ingredients like I was defusing a bomb. I timed every tray, labeled every box, stacked everything with obsessive care because I couldn't afford mistakes. When I delivered the order, my hands were shaking not from fear, but from exhaustion and adrenaline. And then, the next day, she emailed me. She said the desserts were gone within minutes. She asked if I could do another order the following month. I stared at that email for a long time. It wasn't the praise that hit me. It was the stability. Because stability was something I had never been given. Not by family. Not by childhood. Not by anyone. I had to build it. And now, here it was arriving in my inbox like a door cracking open. Orders doubled, then tripled. Word traveled through the quiet networks of small businesses' offices that needed treats for meetings, clinics that wanted dessert trays for staff appreciation days, real estate agents who wanted closing gifts for clients. The kinds of people who didn't care about your story as long as your work was consistent. I started investing back into the business. Larger mixing bowls, sturdier containers, a second set of baking pans so I wouldn't waste time washing between batches, a small printer for labels, a better scale. I upgraded my ingredients slowly, because quality was the only thing that separated me from the thousands of other people trying to sell cookies online. And still, I worked alone. Most nights, it was just me in that kitchen, under fluorescent lights, listening to the hum of refrigeration units and the steady whir of my mixer. Sometimes I would pause, hands covered in flour, and realize how strange it was that my life felt calmer while working through the night than it ever felt in my mother's house during the day. There was no emotional weather here, no sudden storms, no tears that forced the whole room to reorganize itself. Just heat, sugar, and the quiet certainty that effort produced results. Eventually, the shared kitchen became insufficient. I needed more storage, more refrigeration, more space to move. I was constantly hauling ingredients back and forth in my car, stacking bags of flour like sandbags against the flood of orders. My apartment smelled like butter and vanilla. My fridge was filled with trays and containers. I was living inside my own production line. Renting a dedicated kitchen was a financial stretch. The numbers scared me, but I had learned something about fear. Fear doesn't mean stop. Fear means you're standing at the edge of something bigger than what you've known. So I signed the lease. The new kitchen was small and industrial, tucked between a repair shop and a warehouse. It smelled faintly of metal and detergent, but it was mine during the hours I rented it, and that changed everything. I set up shelves. I labeled containers. I created a system. And for the first time, my work had structure. With structure came more orders. I added bars, cakes, and custom desserts to my menu. I created seasonal flavors. I built a simple website. I started scheduling deliveries with routes that required me to wake before sunrise, restock after midday, and work through evenings. My days became a cycle of production lists, ingredient runs, and packaging. It was exhausting, but it was the kind of exhaustion that made sense. The kind that didn't drain your soul. The kind that left you proud. The first time I hired help, it was a quiet college student named Lila. She answered my ad and showed up on time with her hair tied back and her hands ready. She didn't ask personal questions. She didn't gossip. She just worked. She handled labeling, packaging, and basic prep, And within a week, I realized how much time I'd been losing trying to do everything alone. Hiring her wasn't just a business decision, it was a psychological shift. Because it meant I believed my business would last long enough to need another person. It meant I believed I was building something real. And then came the contract that changed everything. A regional cafe chain reached out after tasting one of my dessert bars at a networking event. They wanted weekly deliveries across several locations. The scale intimidated me. I remember sitting in my kitchen late at night, staring at the email, my heart pounding like I was back in my mother's house again, like something big was about to happen and I didn't know if I could handle it. But this time, the fear wasn't tied to someone else's emotions. It was tied to my own growth. I negotiated carefully. I didn't accept a schedule that would destroy me. I refused to compromise quality. I set clear terms. I treated the conversation like a professional, even though part of me still felt like an imposter playing business owner in borrowed shoes. When the contract was signed, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a few quiet tears that surprised me because I hadn't cried like that in years. It wasn't happiness in the simple sense. It was relief. Because for the first time in my life, I had something that no one could take away with a rumor. No one could erase my work with a disappointed look. No one could rewrite my success with tears. The business grew steadily after that. I tracked profits. I reduced unnecessary expenses. I reinvested carefully. I resisted the urge to expand too quickly because I knew what it felt like to build something on unstable ground. I didn't want fast growth. I wanted lasting stability. Month by month, that stability became real. I started seeing numbers that hinted at sustainability, not just survival. I started allowing myself to imagine long-term plans I'd never dared to imagine before. And that's how the idea of homeownership entered my mind. Not as a fantasy, as a possibility. When I toured the house I eventually purchased, I didn't see luxury. I saw potential. A kitchen with counter space wide enough for multiple trays. A pantry large enough for bulk ingredients. A living room where I could host employees for a small end-of-year dinner. Rooms I could use for storage or quiet. Signing the papers felt surreal. Not because the house was extravagant, but because of the years it had taken to reach that point. Stepping into that space, I understood that the life I had built no longer resembled the one I left behind. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that the past couldn't reach me there, that I had finally built something safe. But life has a strange sense of timing. Because the morning after I moved in, while I was still learning the echo of my own hallway, my security camera lit up. Two figures stood on my porch, one with a suitcase, one gripping her sweater like she was preparing to be wronged. My mother and my sister. And in that instant, I realized something chilling. They hadn't come back because they cared. They had come back because my success had finally made me visible again. And visibility, in my family, was never safe. For a few seconds after I saw them on my security camera, I didn't move. I just stood in the middle of my new kitchen, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at the screen like it was showing me a scene from someone else's life. My mother and my sister, Evelyn and Maya, standing on my porch with luggage, shoulders squared, faces set with the kind of confidence people only have when they believe they still own a piece of you. 13 years. That number should have meant something to them. It should have changed their posture, softened their voices, added hesitation to their movements. But they stood there, like the gap between us was nothing more than a minor misunderstanding. Like time was a detail they could ignore, if ignoring it served them. Maya was closest to the door, one hand wrapped around the handle of a suitcase, her body angled toward the threshold, as if stepping inside was a formality. My mother stood slightly behind her, gripping her sweater in that familiar way, part anxiety, part performance. I recognized the formation instantly. It was the same dynamic from childhood, transported into adulthood without any shame. Maya as the fragile center. My mother as the shield. Me as the expected provider. I didn't rush to the door. I didn't panic. I didn't open it out of shock. I watched them longer than necessary. Long enough to notice the small details that made the moment feel unreal. Maya's nails were freshly done. Her hair was styled. She looked prepared, not for a conversation, for an entrance. My mother's eyes kept flicking toward the windows, evaluating the house the way people evaluate something they believe they deserve. It wasn't the sight of them that made my chest tighten. It was what their confidence implied. They hadn't come to apologize. They hadn't come to ask if I was okay. They had come as though they were responding to an invitation I had never sent. And standing there in my kitchen, surrounded by empty counters and the quiet I had fought so hard to earn, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I had always known this day might come. Not because I was paranoid, because patterns don't disappear. They just wait for new opportunities. I walked to the entryway slowly. My footsteps sounded strange in the hallway, like the house was still learning me. On the small console table near the door, the folder I'd prepared sat exactly where I left it. I hadn't told anyone about it. I hadn't even admitted to myself why I made it. But the night before, while unpacking a few boxes, I had felt a familiar tension rise in my chest, the kind that comes when you've spent your life being blindsided. So I prepared. Inside the folder were simple things: written boundaries, a formal notice about uninvited visits, a no trespass statement, a ledger of documented expenses and debts from the past that I had once swallowed in silence, notes I'd kept over the years about incidents, accusations, and the slow way my family had erased me. Not to weaponize, not to punish, but to protect myself. For most of my life, I carried everything in my head. I carried it in my nervous system. I carried it in my silence. But silence had never saved me. Silence only made it easier for them to rewrite the story. So this time, I wrote things down. I picked up the folder and held it against my palm like a weight. Then I opened the door only a few inches. Just enough for them to see me. Just enough for me to see them. Not enough for anyone to step inside. The air outside was crisp, the kind of Colorado morning that feels clean and sharp. My sister smiled first. Wide, bright, rehearsed. "Haley," she said, like we were old friends. My mother didn't smile. Her eyes flicked past me immediately, scanning the hallway behind me like she was checking inventory. Maya shifted her suitcase forward, the wheels bumping against the porch boards. "We're here," she said, as if that explained everything. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and familiar. I could feel them waiting for the old version of me, the version who would step back automatically, who would say, "Come in," even if my stomach was twisting, the version who would apologize for the awkwardness, offer water, offer comfort, offer something to prove I wasn't cruel. But I didn't move. I stayed in the doorway, the gap between us narrow and deliberate. Maya's smile flickered. My mother's expression tightened. And then my mother spoke, like she was continuing a conversation we'd never finished. "We need to talk," she said. Not, "Can we talk?" Not, "Would you be willing?" Just, "We need." It was the same language she used when I was a teenager. The language of obligation disguised as family. I took a slow breath. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, but my voice came out steady. "Communication needs to be by email," I said. "And I'm not doing surprise visits." Maya blinked, as if she hadn't heard me correctly. My mother's eyebrows lifted, offended. "Email?" she repeated, like I'd suggested something obscene. Maya's expression shifted quickly, her eyes widened, her mouth softened, her posture tilted into wounded innocence. "Are you serious?" she asked. "We drove all this way." They lived in the same state. The drive wasn't long, but Maya said it like she'd crossed a desert. My mother stepped forward slightly, the way she always did when she wanted to apply pressure. "You can't just shut us out," she said. "We're your family." That word family hit my ears like a weapon. It wasn't a comfort. It wasn't warmth. In my life, family had always meant responsibility without reciprocity. It meant being blamed and then expected to forgive. It meant being erased and then expected to reopen the door when it benefited them. I looked at Maya's suitcase again. The audacity of it was almost impressive. They hadn't come to ask if they could visit. They had come expecting to stay. Maya's hand stayed on the suitcase handle, like a claim. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't list the years. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't even ask why they were there, Because I already knew. You don't show up with luggage to someone's house after 13 years of silence unless you want something. And if I asked, they would lie anyway. Instead, I lifted the folder slightly, not offering it, not hiding it, just letting them see that I wasn't improvising. Maya's eyes dropped to it. My mother's gaze followed. The dynamic shifted. Maya's confidence faltered for the first time. My mother's mouth tightened. I watched both of them recalculating, realizing that the version of me they remembered, quiet, compliant, endlessly responsible, wasn't standing in front of them anymore. "What is that?" Maya asked, her voice smaller now. "A boundary," I said simply. My mother's face hardened. "You're being dramatic." That sentence was so familiar I almost laughed. It was the same accusation they used whenever I refused to absorb blame quietly. The same word they used to dismiss my pain. I didn't respond to it. I just repeated, calmly, "Email only, no surprise visits, and you can't stay here." Maya's eyes shimmered instantly. She was good. Even after 13 years, she was good. She let her lips tremble. She tilted her head slightly, like she couldn't believe I was capable of cruelty. "I just wanted to see you," she said. I thought maybe we could finally be sisters again." My mother made a sound of agreement, a soft sigh that carried the weight of sacrifice. "After everything," she said. "After all I've done." There it was, the guilt script. The same script that had kept me trapped as a child. But something inside me stayed quiet and solid. Because I wasn't a teenager anymore. I wasn't financially dependent. I wasn't emotionally starved for approval. I had spent 13 years building a life that didn't require their validation. And now they were standing on my porch, trying to use the same tools. I didn't let them in. I didn't offer coffee. I didn't invite conversation. I told them again, calmly, that if they wanted to communicate, they could email. And then I closed the door. Not slammed. Not dramatically. Just closed. I leaned my forehead against the wood for a second after the lock clicked, feeling adrenaline rush through my body like electricity. My hands were shaking, not because I regretted it, but because I had never done something like that before. I had never closed a door on my mother. I had never denied Maya an emotional stage. I walked back to my kitchen and forced myself to take a sip of coffee. It tasted bitter. My stomach felt tight. The house, which had felt peaceful an hour ago, now felt charged as if the walls were holding their breath. I didn't have to wait long for the next part. My phone buzzed again. Then again. Then again. Messages from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Relatives who hadn't checked on me once during 13 years of silence suddenly had opinions about my character. Screenshots arrived. Maya had already posted. A photo of my porch. A caption about how she finally found the courage to reconnect. A vague line about how some people choose money over love. Comments poured in. Prayers, sympathy, anger. People who didn't know me were calling me cold. People who had never heard my voice were describing my heart. I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling something rise in my chest. Not rage, not despair, a strange, quiet clarity. This was the test. Not the porch, not the suitcase, not even my mother's guilt. The real test was whether I would step back into the old role, the one who panicked, defended, explained, and begged to be understood. Because that role was what kept their story alive. And I was done being a character in Maya's narrative. So, instead of replying to the messages, instead of posting my own version, instead of calling anyone to defend myself, I opened my laptop. I drafted a short email. Not an explanation. Not a plea. A policy. Communication, limited to email. No surprise visits. No discussions involving money or housing. Any harassment or repeated uninvited appearances would be handled appropriately. I sent it to every relative whose email I still had. Then I closed my laptop. I didn't wait for responses. I didn't check Maya's page. I went back to my production list for the week. Because the truth was, I had deliveries scheduled. Staff waiting, orders to fill. The ovens didn't care about my family drama. The business didn't pause because my mother decided to show up and reopen old wounds. For the first time in my life, I had something stronger than their chaos. I had structure. And structure is the one thing emotional manipulation can't survive. That night, when my mother's email arrived, one cold line that said, "You've broken your sister's heart," I didn't respond. When her second email arrived, full of sacrifice and guilt, I didn't respond. When Maya posted again, implying I was toxic, I didn't respond. I saved everything. I documented everything. And I kept living. Because the revenge I had waited 13 years for wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be cruel. It was going to be simple. It was going to be me refusing calmly, firmly, to let them step back into my life and rearrange it around Maya's tears. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more the world around me proved something I had never been allowed to believe as a child. Nothing collapses when you stop making yourself responsible for everyone else's emotions. The house stayed standing. The business kept running. My peace held its shape. And as the days passed, I began to realize that the most shocking part of all of this wasn't that they had returned. It was that, for the first time, they had returned. And I didn't open the door. The first week after I closed the door on them, I didn't sleep well. Not because I felt guilty, at least. Not in the way they wanted me to. I slept poorly because my body was still learning a new truth, that I could say no and survive the fallout. For most of my life, no had been a dangerous word. It meant conflict. It meant punishment. It meant being labeled selfish, dramatic, cold. It meant watching my mother's face harden and hearing Maya's voice turn soft and wounded like she was about to bleed in front of an audience. So even though I'd done the right thing, my nervous system didn't celebrate. It stayed on alert, waiting for the next wave. And the next wave came exactly the way I expected it to. It didn't come through my front door. It came through my phone. The messages from relatives kept arriving for days, sometimes hours apart, sometimes back to back like a coordinated attack. People I hadn't spoken to in over a decade suddenly had strong opinions about my character. They didn't ask questions. They didn't want context. They didn't want the truth. They wanted me to return to the role they understood, the one where I took blame quietly so Maya could be comforted loudly. The screenshots were always the same pattern. Maya posted something vague and emotionally charged, and the family rallied around it like it was scripture. You don't realize how toxic someone is until you stop begging them to love you. Some people only show up when they need something. Healing means accepting that even blood can betray you. She never wrote my name, but every comment section read like a trial, where the verdict had already been decided. My cousins responded with prayers. My aunts wrote long paragraphs about forgiveness. One uncle called me ungrateful. A family friend I barely remembered wrote, "Your mother gave you everything. Shame on you." I stared at my phone one night, sitting at my kitchen table under the soft glow of a lamp, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was a strange kind of clarity that almost felt like peace. Because I finally understood something. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted access. And the moment I denied access, they called it cruelty. That's how the family script worked. It always had. In my family, boundaries were treated like betrayal. And the people who benefited from my lack of boundaries were always the loudest when I finally created one. I didn't respond to the posts. I didn't comment. I didn't defend myself publicly. I knew better than to step onto a stage Maya controlled. If I responded, she would twist it. If I stayed silent, she would twist that too. But silence at least kept my energy intact. Instead, I did what I had never done as a teenager. I wrote rules. I opened my laptop and drafted a single email to every relative whose address I still had. It was short, clear, and almost painfully calm. No accusations, no emotional language, no backstory, just terms. Communication with me would be limited to email. No surprise visits. No discussions involving money, housing, or temporary stays. No guilt messages. No group attacks. Anything outside those boundaries would be ignored. I read the email 3 times before sending it. Not because I wanted to perfect the wording, but because I couldn't believe I was allowed to write something like that. It felt almost illegal, like I was breaking some invisible law. Then I hit send. And the response was immediate. Within minutes, replies started flooding in. Some were furious, some were disappointed, some were dripping with moral superiority. One cousin wrote, "This is not how family works." Another wrote, "Your mother is devastated. Do you even care?" Someone else wrote, "Maya has been through enough. Why are you punishing her?" I remember reading that line, "Why are you punishing her?" and laughing quietly to myself because it was so perfectly absurd. Punishing her? I had spent my entire childhood absorbing consequences so Maya wouldn't have to. I had spent my teenage years cleaning up her messes. I had spent my early adulthood being erased so she could be the victim in a story she enjoyed telling. And now, the first time I refused to let her walk into my home and take what she wanted, they called it punishment. The truth was, they couldn't imagine a world where Maya wasn't the center. They couldn't imagine a world where I wasn't the backup. That email didn't calm the situation. It made it worse. Because boundaries don't soothe people who rely on your compliance. Boundaries provoke them. My mother emailed me that same night. No greeting, no punctuation, just one line. "You've broken your sister's heart." I stared at the words for a long time. Not because they hurt, because they were so familiar. It was the same message she'd used my whole life, just dressed in adult language. The idea that Maya's feelings were my responsibility, that Maya's comfort mattered more than my reality, that if Maya was upset, I was automatically guilty. I closed the email without replying. Then another message arrived from my mother later that evening, longer, more detailed, full of sacrifice. She wrote about raising 2 daughters alone, about how hard she worked, about how many nights she stayed awake worrying, about how she never felt supported, about how she did everything for me, and how I was repaying her with cruelty. Every sentence pointed back to the same conclusion. My stability was something she deserved access to, and denying her that access was betrayal. The old version of me would have started typing immediately. I would have explained. I would have apologized for things I didn't do. I would have tried to prove that I wasn't heartless. But I wasn't that girl anymore. So I did something different. I opened a new document and titled it Steps. I wrote down exactly what I would do if they continued showing up uninvited. I listed dates. I saved screenshots. I organized emails into folders. I wrote contact information for a process server. I looked up basic property boundaries and how to document harassment properly. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just adult procedures. I didn't do it because I wanted to hurt them. I did it because I had finally learned that in families like mine, the person who keeps records is the person who survives. For years, Maya had controlled the narrative because she controlled the emotions. She cried, people believed her. She posted, people rallied. She implied, people assumed. That was her power. But paper doesn't care about tears. Documentation doesn't change because someone looks wounded. And as I built that file, something inside me steadied. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to win emotionally. I was protecting myself structurally. The next few weeks were strange. The digital noise continued, Maya posting, relatives commenting, family friends sending messages. But I noticed something I hadn't expected. The more I refused to engage, the more the storm lost energy. Drama needs fuel, and fuel is attention. Maya posted about toxic people and choosing peace. But without my reaction, the story didn't evolve. It stayed stuck in the same loop. She couldn't escalate into a bigger conflict because I wasn't playing my part. Meanwhile, my life kept moving. My ovens still needed preheating. My staff still needed schedules. My suppliers still needed payments. My customers still needed deliveries. I woke up each morning with production lists and route planning. I spent my afternoons checking inventory, answering emails from cafe managers, testing new flavors. I worked until my shoulders ached and my feet burned, but the exhaustion felt clean. It wasn't the kind of exhaustion I grew up with. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't humiliating. It was purposeful. And that purpose became my shield. I didn't realize how much power I had gained until one afternoon, about a month after the porch incident, when my phone buzzed with a message from a cousin I used to be close to. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question. Are you okay? Just 3 words. My throat tightened when I read it, because it was the first time in 13 years anyone in my family had asked me that. I didn't reply right away. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, anger, sadness, suspicion. Because in my world, kindness often came with strings. Eventually, I replied with something simple. I'm fine, I'm working, I'm not discussing this publicly. The cousin didn't push. And that was when I realized something else. Not everyone was fully convinced. Some people were just loud. Some people were just following the crowd. Some people were repeating the story because it was easier than thinking. And as the weeks passed, a few more messages like that came in. Small, quiet, private. People asking, gently, what happened? People admitting they didn't understand why my mother and sister showed up with luggage. People noticing that Maya's story didn't add up. I didn't dump my pain on them. I didn't send them my documentation. I didn't try to recruit allies. I just said, calmly, I'm setting boundaries. I'm not discussing details. And in a strange way, that calm did something my arguments never could. It made them curious, because calm is hard to villainize. A screaming person is easy to label. A defensive person is easy to dismiss. But a calm person who refuses to fight, that unsettles people who are used to drama. The most surprising shift came about 3 months after they first appeared. By then, the constant screenshots had slowed, the family outrage had cooled. Maya's posts were still there, but they weren't getting the same attention. People had moved on to other stories. Sympathy has a short attention span online. And then one evening, an email arrived from Maya. The subject line wasn't family or heartbreak. It was work. The message was short, practical, almost awkward. She asked if I knew anywhere hiring for flexible shifts. No accusations, no guilt, no tears, just a question. I stared at the screen, feeling something complicated rise in my chest. Not forgiveness, not warmth, just recognition. Because underneath all the performance, Maya was still a person who had always relied on the family system to catch her. And now, for the first time, that system was failing her. I didn't invite her into my business. I didn't offer her a job. I didn't reopen the door. I replied with a simple list of staffing agencies and local shops I'd heard were hiring. Then I went back to my spreadsheets. I didn't wait to see how she reacted. I didn't chase a new relationship. I didn't take responsibility for her future. Because my boundary wasn't just about my house. It was about my role. And I was done being the person everyone leaned on while they called me selfish for needing rest. That was the beginning of the shift. Not a reunion. Not an apology. Just a small crack in the narrative. A moment where Maya stopped performing long enough to ask for something real. And as I sat in my quiet kitchen that night, I realized the strangest part of all of it. My revenge wasn't making them suffer. My revenge was that my life didn't fall apart without them. My revenge was that I stayed calm. That I kept working. That I kept my peace. And in the silence after the storm, I finally understood what 13 years had taught me. You don't win against a family like mine by proving you're right. You win by refusing to be available for the same damage ever again. By the time the first full year passed after I bought my house, the folder near my entryway had become part of the furniture. Not because I used it, because I didn't have to. It stayed there on the console table, like a quiet reminder, proof that I had finally learned how to protect myself without turning my life into a war. For a long time, I thought boundaries were something you only needed when people were obviously dangerous. I didn't realize you also need them when people are familiar, when they smile, when they say your name like they still have a claim on you, when they use love as a lever. The months after Maya's work email were quieter, not magically healed, not warm, but quieter in a way that felt real. The family outrage faded the way online outrage always does. People moved on. The relatives who had sent long lectures stopped sending them. My inbox stopped feeling like a courtroom. Maya's vague posts about betrayal and toxic people slowed down, then shifted into something else: complaints about late shifts, jokes about caffeine, short captions that didn't center around being wronged. I didn't check her page myself. I never went looking. I only heard bits through the few cousins who still occasionally messaged me privately. At first, I didn't trust it. I assumed it was another performance, another phase, another way to control the narrative. But the difference was, she wasn't using me as the villain anymore. And I didn't realize how much relief that brought until one evening when I came home after a long production day, kicked off my shoes, and noticed something strange. My shoulders weren't tense. My jaw wasn't clenched. I wasn't rehearsing arguments in my head. For years, I had lived like I was constantly preparing for a trial no one else knew was happening. A mental courtroom where I was always the defendant. Always trying to prove I wasn't cruel. Always trying to explain that I wasn't the kind of person my family insisted I was. That internal noise had been so constant I thought it was normal. But now, it was fading. And in the space it left behind, my life started to fill itself with something I had never had before. Community. Not the kind built on obligation. Not the kind that collapses if you say no. The kind built on choice. My house slowly became a real home. The empty rooms started to gain purpose. One became a storage room for bulk ingredients and packaging supplies. One became a small office with a desk, a printer, and a wall calendar covered in delivery schedules. The kitchen, my favorite part, became the heart of everything. It wasn't just where I cooked, it was where I planned, where I breathed, where I reminded myself, every morning, that I was safe. I started hosting small gatherings without even realizing I was doing it. A neighbor brought over soup when I caught a cold. I invited her in. We sat at my table and talked about nothing important. It felt revolutionary. Later, I invited 2 employees over after a brutal holiday rush, and we ate leftover pastries straight from the box, laughing like we'd survived a storm together. A friend from the kitchen rental days came by one Friday night with a bottle of wine and a bag of chips, and we ended up playing cards until midnight. The house that had once echoed with absence filled with low, honest laughter. The kind that didn't require me to shrink. The kind that didn't demand I absorb blame to earn a seat at the table. And I realized, slowly, that this was what I had been craving my whole life, not family in the biological sense, but safety in the emotional sense. The folder stayed near the door, untouched. It didn't make me bitter. It made me clear. Then, around the 6-month mark after the porch incident, my mother emailed again. This time, the message was different. No sermons. No sacrifice speech. No guilt disguised as concern. Just one sentence. Can I see the house once? I stared at it for a long time. My first instinct was to delete it. My second instinct was to laugh. The audacity of her asking, after 13 years of silence, after showing up with luggage, after trying to turn the family against me, after blaming me for breaking Maya's heart. But then something else rose in me. Not softness, not forgiveness, just curiosity. Because the email wasn't framed like a demand. It wasn't written like she assumed she was entitled to my space. It was, for the first time, a request. And requests are different. Requests can be answered with terms. So I replied with clear conditions. A specific day, a specific time, only her, no Maya, no surprise guest, no staying longer than an hour, no discussions about money, no discussions about the past, unless she could keep her voice calm and her words honest. I didn't send those conditions to punish her. I sent them because I had finally learned that if someone wants access to you, they can prove they deserve it by respecting your boundaries. She agreed. Her reply was short. Okay. On the day she came, I cleaned the house twice. Not because I needed to impress her, but because anxiety makes you do strange things. I baked a simple tray of lemon bars because my hands needed something to do. When the doorbell rang, my heart kicked hard in my chest. I stood in the hallway for a second, staring at the folder on the console table, and then I opened the door. My mother stood there alone. No suitcase. No dramatic expression. No performance. She looked older. Not dramatically, but in the subtle way time changes someone's posture. Her shoulders seemed heavier. Her hair had more gray, and for the first time, She didn't look like a woman arriving to reclaim something. She looked like a woman arriving to witness something she didn't understand. I stepped back and let her in. She walked through the house slowly, her eyes moving over the walls, the clean counters, the organized pantry, the lined-up baking trays. She paused in the kitchen longer than anywhere else. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the counter, like she was trying to confirm it was real. "It's nice," she said. The word sounded awkward in her mouth, like praise was something she wasn't used to giving me. I nodded. "Thank you." We sat at the kitchen table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was just heavy with history. My mother looked around as if she was searching for the version of me she remembered, the one who was tense, exhausted, apologetic. But she wasn't going to find her, because I wasn't her anymore. She commented on small things: the depth of the sink, the sturdiness of the chairs, the fact that I had enough plates for a full table of people. She asked how business was going. I answered in numbers and schedules, the way I always did. She didn't ask about Maya right away. I didn't bring her up. And I realized something in that moment. We were two adults sitting in a house that belonged fully to one of us. The power dynamic had changed, and she could feel it. At one point, she said softly, "You've built a lot." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't nothing. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to squeeze an apology out of her. I didn't need her to validate my pain for it to be real. I didn't need her to admit she was wrong for me to know I deserved better. I just said, I had to. She nodded like she understood more than she wanted to admit. When she left, she paused at the doorframe, her hand resting lightly on the wood. It wasn't a blessing. It wasn't a claim. It felt more like an acknowledgement, quiet, reluctant, but real. Then she walked away, and I closed the door again. But this time, I didn't feel adrenaline. I didn't feel fear. I felt steady. Life kept going. My business kept growing. The ovens kept heating. Employees kept showing up. Maya sent one more email a few weeks later, short, almost stiff, telling me she'd gotten a job through one of the agencies I'd recommended. She didn't thank me. She didn't apologize. But she attached a photo of herself in a uniform with an employee badge clipped to her shirt. Fluorescent lights. Tired eyes. No dramatic caption. Just reality. I saved the photo in a folder on my computer and left it there. Not as proof she had changed. As proof that change was possible, even for someone who had spent her whole life avoiding responsibility. Nearly a year after I bought the house, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Maya had been promoted to shift supervisor. Her online presence had shifted again, less betrayal, more exhaustion, more jokes about work. People stopped sending me screenshots because there was nothing dramatic left to send. And I realized something I hadn't expected. My family didn't heal because we had a big emotional conversation. They didn't heal because someone finally admitted the truth. They shifted because the system no longer worked the way it used to. Maya couldn't perform her way into my home. My mother couldn't guilt her way into my stability. The relatives couldn't shame me into being the family sponge again. And without my participation, their old dynamic collapsed. Not with a bang, with a slow, quiet fade. Looking back, I don't see my story as a clever revenge arc. There was no moment where I stood triumphant while they begged for forgiveness. There was no dramatic speech where everyone clapped. Real life doesn't wrap pain in neat bows. What happened was quieter. And to me, more important. I stopped letting other people's denial dictate the shape of my days. I learned that love without boundaries isn't generosity. It's erosion. I learned that you can wish someone well without giving them a key to your front door, your bank account, or your nervous system. I learned that being called selfish by people who benefit from your exhaustion is not a reliable measure of your worth. And I learned something else too, something I wish someone had told me when I was younger. You don't owe closeness to people who only recognize you when you become useful again. You are allowed to protect the life you built, even when the hands knocking are familiar, even when they say your name like they still own it, even when they call your boundaries cruelty. Because sometimes, the most powerful form of revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's refusing to disappear ever again. If you've stayed with me through this story, then you already know it was never really about a house, or even about money. It was about something quieter and harder to name. It was about the roles families assign without asking, the way one person becomes the fragile one, and another becomes the one who carries everything until they finally break. This wasn't a revenge story built on shouting or humiliation. It was revenge built on boundaries, documentation, and the slow, painful decision to stop shrinking just to keep other people comfortable. And maybe that's why it hits so deep, because a lot of us don't lose family in one dramatic moment. We lose them in 1,000 small choices, where the truth is ignored and the loudest emotions win. If this story stirred something in you about guilt, favoritism, or the courage it takes to protect the life you built, then I hope you remember this. Protecting yourself is not cruelty. Sometimes it's the first real act of love you've ever given yourself. Thank you for listening, wherever you are in the world. And if you want more stories like this raw, emotional, and real, please subscribe to Hanji Wei Iyagi. Your support helps these stories travel further, and it reminds people they're not alone.